And this is not just a Cuban problem. It's an American problem. It's a problem all over the world. So the way Marxism imposes itself is that it begins by making small demands. It begins by highlighting real issues in society and criticizing society until everyone on the majority begins to make these small concessions. But you see, they're not interested in making a concession. They're not interested in the middle ground. What they're interested in is in us destroying our own society.
Hello and welcome. This is Deep Dive and I'm Tiffany Meier. And as you can see, we have switched things up. We are no longer in a studio today. We are here at the National Conservatism Conference in Orlando, Florida. And we had the pleasure of sitting down with Marcell Felipe, Cuban-American activist and founder of Marcell Felipe Attorneys. Let's dive in. So, Marcell, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So recently in July, right, there's all the protests in Cuba. But after that, it seems like there's no news about them. And then the latest I've seen is last Thursday, they passed some new laws. So what do you see these laws doing? Are they actually changing anything?
They're not changing anything. I think the Cuban people woke up. They said enough is enough. We're reaching about the same point in our history as Russia was in 1989. And I think the feeling that you get on the ground is very similar to the Eastern Europe in 1989. We're preparing for a new wave of protests this 15th of November. In fact, we have a delegation of the European Parliament led by the Czechs, who have been great in supporting us, and Spain's Vox Party, coming to Miami to support the November 15th protest in Cuba. Unfortunately, this time, the government is also making all the preparations. We hope that this will not be a Tiananmen Square. We hope that this will be a velvet revolution. We'll see what happens, but if it's not November 15th, it'll be soon. In Cuba, there is no more revolution. All that's left is a dictatorship, and the people have had it. They're done with it.
And so some have brought up that even the ones protesting don't actually know what freedom is because they've never lived through it. So if this protest succeeds and they, the oppressors or whatever are overthrown, what is going to take its place? Like, what would the new government look like?
Look, I'm never concerned about what happens if freedom rings. I'm more concerned about what we do to make sure it rings. One of the things that we saw extremely disappointing for us here in the United States was President Biden's response to the unprecedented rise of the Cuban people this past July. Rather than speak directly to them, rather than tell the military leaders in Cuba that they can be the heroes of a new republic or the last oppressors of a dying regime, he spoke directly to the government and asked them to take control of the situation. That was very, very discomforting, certainly sent a chilling message to any military official who was thinking of siding with the people. We saw it change. We saw law enforcement go from originally becoming part of the protests, and a lot of times taking off their uniforms and joining us, to eventually falling in line and organizing and going against the people. So it's really, really disappointing when we see that. Now, what happens afterwards? I chair a project called Ideas for Cuba. And Ideas for Cuba really takes advantage of the fact that we are one of the last communist strongholds, to be able to learn from the lessons of Eastern Europe, to be able to learn from what happened in these societies and how we can make sure that the change that happens in Cuba is a strong, permanent democratic change, that we don't fall into the trap that Russia fell into and become a mafia state, a sort of Cold War 2.0 type of situation. And I think that one of the key aspects to that is to make sure that you have a robust judicial system, that the law is the one that governs, and that there's no corruption. I think that's key. I think that there's a number of things we've been discussing in terms of economic development. That's also extremely important. We can go into that subject for quite a while. There's a lot of things, but more importantly is the moment you have the chance, the moment you taste freedom, at least in our case, there will be no going back. So I'm not worried about what happens then. I'm worried about getting there.
And so you mentioned that, say, some of the law enforcement had first started by joining the protesters and now are kind of turning against them. Why do you think there was that shift?
Well, it was directly the Biden administration's. You saw it. I mean, when this first happened, we had a sit-down with Governor Ron DeSantis at our museum, the American Museum of the Cuban Diaspora. I gathered all our leaders from our community, and Governor DeSantis sat there to listen and to understand. One of the first things that I said is, it's very important that when we speak, when we give our public messaging, we don't speak to the Cuban government. We need to speak to the Cuban people, and we need to speak to the Cuban military. Before we talk about any military intervention, the first intervention that needs to come is from the Cuban military. Cuba is militarily divided really into three forces: the police force, the dreaded interior security, which are the Gestapo of Cuba, and the military. And the military, there's still a level of professionalism that one can expect, and we have had folks reaching out from the Cuban military. So one can expect them to take a stand. But you need to support them. You need to speak to them and tell them, as the United States, that in fact, we're here. If you decide to make that move, you will have support. Instead, what we saw from the Biden administration was the opposite message. We need the Cuban government to take control. We need the Cuban government to do better for its people. The people in Cuba weren't asking for the Cuban government to do better. They weren't asking for the Cuban government to respect their rights. They were simply asking for the Cuban government to leave. And when you stop short of that in your messaging, you're not supporting the Cuban people. You're backing the Cuban government. And in the face of that, who's going to take that risk? What military general is going to say, you know what, I'm going to take the risk to my family, to myself, and go out on a limb, knowing that the United States is not going to back them? That's the message that we send, and it's unfortunate, and it's a sign of a greater threat for America, and that is that Marxism has taken a very strong hold in the Democratic Party in the United States, and it will end up eating the Democratic Party. Democrats don't understand that Marxists do not like them. They see them as useful idiots to be used and then discarded once their true intentions are able to be revealed. And they allow them to fester at their own peril. And they've allowed the party of Martin Luther King, the party that had Dr. King's vision of a colorblind society, to become the party of modern segregationists and racial critical race theory. So it's unfortunate, but as bad as it is for Cubans, I think it's equally a bad reflection on America.
And so what can, say, maybe the average Joe at home do? Because it sounds like right now it's like up to, say, the president or high-level officials. But is there anything the common person could do to try and help?
Absolutely. We live in a new world where every citizen has a platform through social media, and it's a dangerous social media, absolutely. But it's also a tool that can be used and can be harnessed. Go out, speak your mind. The most important thing that citizens can do at every forum, whether it's social media, whether it's public forums, or whether it's in conversations with friends and family, is to not be shy about expressing their views, what they believe in their hearts and minds to be correct. Because one of the problems that we have, and this is not just a Cuban problem, it's an American problem, it's a problem all over the world, is that the way Marxism imposes itself is that it begins by making small demands. It begins by highlighting real issues in society and criticizing society, until everyone on the majority begins to make these small concessions. But you see, they're not interested in making a concession. They're not interested in the middle ground. What they're interested in is in us destroying our own society, so that then, when there's nothing else left to believe in, they could bring in their ideology, and they'll be a lot more receptive. We're seeing some of the beginnings of that in the United States, and it's unfortunate. We have to have the morals to ask our elected officials to stop behaving like politicians, start behaving like leaders, and do and say and speak up for what we know it's right and what our mind tells us it's right.
And is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, following along those same lines, one of the things that I would tell you is 2020, I think, was a wake-up call for America. 2020, what began as a civil rights protest turned into a Marxist-led protest. And unfortunately, too many, rather than meet the challenge of addressing it and pointing it out, simply rode the wave. As a result, the Marxist-led BLM organization is now a powerhouse with hundreds of millions of dollars that it's using particularly to defeat the very Democrats that enabled them. That should have been a wake-up call. Let's stop letting people tell us how we should think, how we should act. Look inside yourself and don't be afraid. Don't be shy. Don't worry about the public ridicule that the far left will unleash on you. because ultimately the people watching think like you. We are the silent majority. And if we have that courage, I think we will change the course of what's been set for us.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm a big fan. Thank you.
Thank you. And for those just tuning in, that was today's episode with Marcell Felipe, Cuban-American activist and founder of Marcell Felipe Attorneys. But what do you think? Let me know below. Thanks for tuning in to Deep Dive. I'm Tiffany Meier, and see you soon.